On the morning of Friday, May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Kola sat down for breakfast with his wife Myrna inside of their kitchen in their spacious 4-bedroom house in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Dennis picked up the newspaper and, like always, began reading the front page out loud to Myrna. This was an activity the couple enjoyed doing together every morning. According to the story on the front page, the stock market was struggling and unemployment was on the rise. But Myrna didn't bat an eye. She knew that she and Dennis would be fine because they had made a ton of money throughout their 42-year marriage by owning multiple successful businesses, from a chain of pharmacies to a Ford car dealership that Dennis owned with his son. But a few years earlier, Dennis had seen the writing on the wall when it came to the country's economy. So he had sold his businesses before things got too bad, and he had walked away with enough money for him and Myrna to be set for the rest of their lives without having to work. But the truth was, Dennis and Myrna actually loved to work, kind of independent of making money, so they weren't quite ready to just full-on retire. And so after selling his companies, Dennis had returned to his old job as a pharmacist, and Myrna worked at a local middle school as a substitute teacher. And so on this Friday morning, because of his work commitments, Dennis didn't have time to read beyond just the first few pages of the newspaper. After putting the paper down, Dennis finished his breakfast, then gave his wife a kiss on the cheek and told her he loved her, and then he walked out the front door. Once outside, Dennis climbed into his truck and began the 40-mile drive to the nearby town where he worked at this local pharmacy. And while Dennis made his commute, Myrna cleaned up the kitchen and then headed out to work herself. And as she drove the short distance to West Salem Middle School, she passed by all these mini mansions that were just like hers, with wide, well-manicured lawns, and then she drove by the neighborhood golf course and banquet hall. Myrna couldn't picture a better place for her and Dennis to grow old together, a small community filled with friends where she always felt comfortable and safe. And she loved how close her neighborhood was to the rest of her family. Dennis and Myrna had 2 grown children who also had children of their own, and Myrna thought there was nothing better than having the family over and spending time with the grandkids she adored. Myrna finally arrived at the middle school, and she went inside and walked down a long hall to the classroom where she had been assigned that day. She opened the door, and the faces of the students lit up. Myrna was the kids' favorite substitute teacher. The school day passed quickly for Myrna, and as always, she made each period pass just as quickly for her students by making sure the lessons were actually fun. Myrna had always believed that learning should be an enjoyable experience and not a slog where every minute feels like an hour. Myrna worked that day at the school until around 3 p.m., and then the final bell rang, and she told her class to have a great weekend, and she said she'd be back as their substitute on Monday. Then Myrna headed outside, hopped in her car, and made her way home, and then once there, she did some chores around the house, and when she was done with her housework, she sat down in the home office and logged on to her computer. About 45 minutes later, around 6 p.m., her husband, Dennis, pulled back up to the house after his day of work. He parked his truck and made his way onto the porch, eager to get inside and have dinner with his wife. Dennis opened the door and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen, his keys dangling from his hand, and then Dennis stepped into the kitchen and called out to his wife. And then suddenly, everything went black. Three days later, on Monday at 7:50 a.m., the morning bell rang at West Salem Middle School, marking the beginning of the official day. Students all took their seats in all the classrooms, and the school kind of went quiet as the teachers began their lessons. That is, in every classroom but one. In that one classroom, the chair behind the teacher's desk remained empty, and so the students in that classroom just remained standing up and chatting with each other, aware of the fact that their teacher was not there, but not that worried because they liked having some extra time. However, these students' obvious restlessness caught the ear of an administrator who happened to be walking by the classroom. And the administrator stepped into the room and asked what was going on, and the students said their substitute teacher still hadn't shown up. Concerned, the administrator told the students to wait quietly, and then he returned to the front office to double-check the schedule. This was the class that Myrna Kola had been assigned to teach that week, and apparently she had just not shown up for work and didn't tell anybody. The administrator pulled up Myrna's file and dialed her phone number, but no one answered. So the administrator checked Myrna's emergency contact info, and he found it was her son, Eric. Eric Kola was home with his wife when he got the phone call from the administrator. Eric told the administrator that he had no idea why his mom wouldn't show up for work, but he told him he'd try to get in touch with her and report back as soon as he could. Eric hung up and dialed his mom's cell phone, but it just rang and rang until it went to voicemail. So Eric called his father, who at this point in the morning would have been in his truck on his way to work, and so in theory would have been ready to receive a phone call, but he too did not answer his phone. After both parents didn't pick up, Eric turned to his wife, looking concerned, and said something wasn't right, that this was totally out of character for his parents to just go completely incommunicado. And so Eric called his sister, Cindy, and asked her if she had had any contact with their parents, but Cindy said that she hadn't talked to them since before the weekend. After Eric ended this call, he told his wife that he was just going to go to his parents' house to see what the heck was going on. And about 10 minutes later, Eric slowed his truck to a stop in front of the house, and he saw his dad's truck was out front. Eric parked, walked up the driveway to the side of the house, and he looked into his parents' 3-car garage. And he could see his mother's car, a Mountaineer, was also parked inside, so his parents had to be home. Eric opened the garage with the opener his parents had given him, he walked past his mother's SUV, and then he opened the unlocked door to the house and stepped inside. And as he walked towards the kitchen, he saw his father. Dennis was lying there, motionless on the kitchen floor. Eric ran to his father, and he saw there was a pool of blood all around him. Eric got down on the floor and grabbed his dad's leg, desperately trying to shake him awake. But not only was Dennis unresponsive, his body was totally stiff. And so in a panic, Eric grabbed his phone and dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he told them as best as he could what he had seen, and the operator, who was very calm, asked Eric if anyone else was in the house. And so Eric, who didn't know, began walking down the hall, and when he looked into the office, he cried out. There was his mother, slumped over the desk at the computer. Her skin had turned purple. The operator calmly asked Eric if his mother was still breathing, and Eric replied that no, she wasn't, that both of his parents had to be dead. A little while after Eric's 911 call, Agent John Christopherson of the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation and members of his team arrived at the Cola's house. Christopherson saw 2 deputies from the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department talking to Eric in the front yard. And he saw several of the Cola's neighbors standing on their porches, looking completely stunned by all the police activity. I mean, this stuff didn't happen in this neighborhood. Christopherson knew major crime was rare in this community, and a double homicide was basically unheard of. That was a big reason Christopherson and the state police had been brought in to lead this investigation. Agent Christopherson got out of his car, walked across the yard, and introduced himself to the deputies and to Eric. And he let them both know that he'd be back soon to ask some questions. Then he led members of his team into the Cola's house. The smell of decomposing bodies hit them immediately, and the smell instantly told them that the victims must have been dead for quite a while. Christopherson walked to the kitchen, and he saw Dennis lying face down on the floor. Dennis was surrounded by a pool of coagulated blood, and he had a hole in the right side of his head. Dennis was still wearing his jacket, and his car keys were clutched tightly in his hand. So Christopherson figured that Dennis must have been shot shortly after he walked through the front door of his house. After looking around the kitchen, Christopherson walked down the hall to the office, where he knew the second victim had been found. He saw Myrna's body hunched over the desk. She had an obvious bullet wound in the back of her head, and her left arm was resting on the computer keyboard, as if she had been typing when someone walked up behind her and shot her. Christopherson turned around and glanced back at the office door. He wondered if the killer had stood there and watched this woman at her computer before shooting her. There was something cold-blooded about the idea, like a predator observing its prey before moving in for the kill. While Christopherson searched the office, a member of the investigative team walked inside and told Christopherson that he needed to see something upstairs. So Christopherson followed the officer up a carpeted staircase, down a hallway, and into Myrna and Dennis's bedroom. It appeared like the room had been ransacked. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, but as Christopherson walked across the room to the dresser, he felt like there was something unusual about the bedroom scene. Their dresser drawers had all been pulled out and left open in a way that a robber wouldn't have actually been able to see what was in each drawer, and it didn't look like anyone had actually dug through the drawers or taken anything. So Christopherson wondered if maybe the killer had tried to stage the room to look like a robbery, even though that's not what it was. Christopherson continued to walk around the room, and he quickly found pieces of Myrna's very expensive jewelry just sitting out, untouched, so that only added to his suspicion that the apparent ransacking in the bedroom really had been staged. Christopherson finished searching the room and then made his way down the hall to an upstairs guest room. This room looked untouched. But then, when he opened the door to a walk-in closet inside of this room, something immediately caught the agent's eye. It was a .22 caliber rifle propped up against the wall. Christopherson looked up, and he saw, on a shelf right above the rifle, was an opened box of ammunition. He kneeled down to look closer at the rifle, and he noticed there was an indentation in the carpet nearby that was about the same size and shape as the butt of the gun. It looked like the indentation was where the rifle had been resting, but then just recently, someone must have moved that rifle, and when they returned it, they didn't put it back exactly where they'd found it, in the indentation. Christofferson had a member of his team bag the rifle and the box of ammunition and book them into evidence. Then Christofferson headed downstairs and outside and joined the deputies who were talking to Eric. After telling Eric how sorry he was for his loss, Christofferson said, "Look, I have to ask you right now about what you know, because this is a murder investigation and this needs to move quickly." And so he asked Eric when was the last time he saw his parents alive. Eric said it had been Thursday night, so 4 nights earlier. He had stopped by the house to help his mother do laundry and to help his father replace some boards out on the deck. And before Eric left, Eric told Christofferson that his father had said to him, "I love you, son." And Eric had said back, "Yeah, I love you too, Dad." He said that was the last time they actually spoke. Eric did tell Christofferson that weekend he had tried calling his parents to invite them to a cookout, but they didn't pick up, so he left a voicemail, and his parents didn't call him back, but he didn't think it was that big of a deal because he knew his parents had plans with friends that weekend. After hearing this, Christofferson asked Eric if he knew of anyone who might have access to his parents' residence. Eric said he couldn't think of anyone specifically, but he did say his parents often kept their doors unlocked. This didn't really surprise Christofferson because that's how safe this community was. But now he wondered if maybe someone had exploited that sense of security and just slipped inside the house through an unlocked door. As Eric continued to speak with Christofferson and the other police officers, Eric's sister, Cindy Cowell, arrived at the property. And as she walked across the yard towards them, Christofferson could tell she'd been crying. After Cindy walked over to them, she gave her brother a hug, and the two of them did their best to comfort each other and also to provide any additional information that might help. But neither of them could think of anyone who might have had a motive to kill their parents. And so this double murder was turning into a total mystery. The next day, the medical examiner performed autopsies on Dennis and Myrna, and the results were far from surprising. Each had been shot in the head. But there was an important detail. The bullet that had struck them in the head was a .22 caliber bullet. And this was an important detail for Christofferson because it was the same caliber bullet used in the rifle he'd found in the upstairs bedroom closet. And that rifle had clearly been recently moved because of that indentation he saw in the carpet. And Christofferson thought that if that rifle was the murder weapon, then the killer had to have known Dennis and Myrna well enough to know where they kept that gun. Christofferson wanted to develop a timeline of the Colas' last day. However, the autopsies did not pinpoint the exact times of their deaths, so he still wasn't even sure what day they had died. But one thing he did know was that Myrna had clearly been using her computer when she was killed, so his team sent Myrna's computer to a forensic data lab where the hard drive could be analyzed for timestamps. And this data revealed that Myrna had begun using her computer at exactly 5:14 p.m. on Friday, May 21st, and her very last keystroke was made at 5:41 p.m. that same evening. And so Christofferson believed that 5:41 p.m. on May 21st was the exact time of Myrna's death. Then Christofferson, using this information, figured out when Dennis had left work on that day and how long generally it would take Dennis to drive back home. And based on this, Christofferson concluded that Dennis most likely got home around 6 p.m. So he estimated that Dennis's time of death was about 20 minutes after his wife's death. So at this point, Christofferson knew that the Colas had very likely been killed in the early evening of May 21st, 3 days before they were actually discovered. And also, based on the timeline, whoever had shot Myrna had very likely waited inside of the house to then kill Dennis when he walked inside. Christofferson knew that Dennis and Myrna were well off financially, and they had multiple investments and life insurance policies with very big payouts, so money had to be considered as a potential motive. And investigators soon learned that the beneficiaries of Dennis and Myrna's life insurance policies were their kids, Eric and Cindy, and they stood to inherit over $700,000 each. And so obviously when you include the fact that Eric was the one who found the bodies, this made the kids highly suspicious. And so Christofferson decided he would speak to them both, but he would start with Eric. And so the day after the discovery of the bodies, Eric arrived at the police station and he sat down across from Christofferson inside of a small interview room. And Eric appeared to be very grief-stricken, but at the same time, Christofferson could tell Eric was eager to help. He spoke in a cooperative tone and never came across as defensive. And so the first question Christofferson asked Eric was, how was his relationship with his parents? Eric said he had always gotten along with both of his parents. He said his father was a great business partner because they worked at that car dealership together, and also they played golf together all the time. Eric said he also made a point to see his mother as much as he could and also help her out around the house because she refused to slow down even though she was almost 70. After that, Christofferson asked Eric to walk him through what he did all day on Friday, May 21st, which is again the day that Christofferson believed the two victims were killed. Eric said that day he spent the morning and afternoon doing what he normally did, day trading. Day trading is a form of securities trading where the trader buys stocks and other assets and then sells them the same day, taking advantage of price fluctuations that occur between the opening and closing of the trading day. And Eric would say he was actually a pretty successful day trader, often pulling in between $7,000 and $10,000 a month. The only downside being that it required him to sit at home on his computer for hours and hours on end. After he finally got up from his computer, he left his house to meet up with his friend to help grout and tile a shower. He said he was with that friend until about 5:30 p.m., and then he went to pick up his wife at home because they were going out to celebrate their 16th wedding anniversary. Now, to this point in the interview, it was very cut and dry. Eric is doing his best to be composed, but at this point, Eric just suddenly shook his head and began laughing. Christofferson was very surprised at this and asked, did I miss something funny? Eric stopped laughing and said, it's not really funny, but I had known about this day, our anniversary, for a long time. We had planned it all out. But as I was going back home that day, I actually realized I totally forgot to buy an actual anniversary gift. And so Eric would explain that he stopped at a retail store called Shopko to buy his wife a hanging plant because he knew his wife loved hanging plants, and he also knew the exact type to get her. And so Eric said he went inside the shop and he browsed the store's garden center for a while, but he didn't actually see the plant that his wife liked. So he drove to a different Shopko location, and he did find the right hanging plant there. And he paid for it, and then drove home, and then he and his wife had gone out for their celebration. And then right after he said that, Eric looked like he had just remembered something out of the blue. And he pulled his wallet out, and he took out a receipt for this plant, and he slid it across the table to Christofferson, saying that he had held on to this receipt in case his wife didn't like the plant, and so she could return it. Christofferson looked at the receipt, and it did confirm that Eric had bought this plant at 6:15 p.m. at the Shopko. After that, Christofferson asked Eric to wait in the interview room while he reached out to Eric's friend to confirm that they really had met up on that Friday to grout and tile the bathroom. And so Christofferson got the friend's number, stepped into the hall, and gave him a call, and the friend confirmed that Eric had left his house around 5:30 that evening. And so at this point, Christofferson concluded that based on Eric's timeline, he didn't really have enough time to have also driven to his parents' house to kill them, between leaving his friend's house and then getting that plant at Shopko. So Christofferson did not think Eric was as likely of a suspect as he originally seemed. So Christofferson walked back into the interview room and asked Eric if he could think of anyone at all, who may have had a reason to harm his parents. Eric hesitated, and then with obvious reluctance in his voice, he said they should look into his sister, Cindy, and her husband, Patrick. When asked to explain why, Eric said that Cindy had been having some very serious financial problems. She was living paycheck to paycheck, earning close to minimum wage, working for a collections agency. Meanwhile, her husband, Patrick, didn't work at all. They had a mortgage and other expenses, and Cindy had been borrowing money from their parents to help make ends meet. In fact, she actually owed her parents tens of thousands of dollars. And then also, Eric said that his sister's husband, Patrick, was just generally kind of a bad guy. And also, Eric knew his parents did not like Patrick at all, and often referred to him as a, quote, lazy bum. But Eric said he wasn't sure if his parents even knew just how bad things really were between Cindy and her husband Patrick. Eric said Patrick had a violent temper and had once pulled a gun on Cindy after she threatened to leave him. Patrick allegedly told Cindy that the only way she'd be leaving him was in a body bag. Christofferson was shocked at this information. If this was true, this was a huge red flag. The idea that Patrick had literally pulled a gun out and actually threatened to kill someone certainly made him a pretty big suspect. But Christofferson kind of tempered his reaction to this and just thanked Eric for coming in and speaking to him. And then after Eric was gone, Christofferson immediately reached out to Cindy to set up a meeting. The following day, Cindy showed up at the station and joined Christofferson in the interview room. And right away, Christofferson could tell Cindy seemed very rattled and sort of nervous. But Christofferson didn't react to that and just thanked her for coming in and reiterated how sorry he was for her loss. His voice was calm and friendly, and he told Cindy there was no reason to be nervous, this was just an interview, not an interrogation. Cindy nodded, but still seemed very nervous. Christofferson began the interview by asking Cindy when was the last time she spoke to her parents. and Cindy said she had spoken to her father on Friday morning, so the day that Dennis and Myrna were killed. Cindy said during this conversation with her dad, she had talked about her and her husband's mounting financial troubles. She had told her father that she and Patrick had absolutely no money, and to make matters worse, the unemployment check that Patrick was expecting hadn't arrived yet. Cindy said her father had been sort of blunt with her that morning. He criticized her husband for not supporting her and their daughter, and then he told Cindy he would not keep giving her any more money. Cindy looked like she was about to cry. She told Christofferson that her father's rejection was so upsetting for her, and she felt like Eric was the favorite child, the golden boy, while she was just a disappointment to her parents. After that, Christofferson asked her what she had done the rest of that day after she had spoken to her father. Cindy said she'd been at work until about 4:45 p.m. She left the office and stopped at a convenience store to buy some groceries, and then she got home between 5:30 and 6. And once she was home, she spent the rest of the evening with her daughter and husband. Christofferson took down Cindy's work information and said that was all he needed from her for now, and that he would follow up if necessary. After the interview, members of the investigative team went to Cindy's office and obtained her punch cards. And the punch cards would show that yes, Cindy had clocked out at 4:45 p.m. Next, they drove over to the convenience store where Cindy said she had done her grocery shopping, and the manager of that store gave them access to the surveillance footage from that day, and it didn't take investigators long to find Cindy in the video, shopping in the store during the time frame she said she was. And so, just like with her brother, the investigators concluded that basically based on the timeline, there wasn't enough time for Cindy to have gone to her parents' house and killed them. But Agent Christofferson couldn't completely rule Cindy out yet. Even if she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, what's to say her husband, Patrick, the man who apparently had, a temper and had previously drawn a gun on Cindy and threatened her life, who's to say he didn't pull the trigger? And also maybe Cindy was involved somehow with the murder, that she helped coordinate it for Patrick. But before Christofferson jumped to that conclusion and brought Patrick in and really drilled him hard on what he was doing on that day, he first wanted to check to see if Eric's description of Patrick was actually accurate. And what Christofferson learned was Patrick had apparently cheated on Cindy at some point, he abused drugs, and he had difficulty holding down jobs, and because he was currently unemployed, he had a lot of free time and not a lot of money. Christofferson also learned that Myrna did not like Patrick so much that she had warned Cindy that if she stayed married to Patrick, there's a chance that she would just deny her getting her inheritance, that basically Patrick could not touch this money, and that was the reason she wouldn't be getting it. And Patrick was definitely aware of this, and also he was aware that Cindy's parents were apparently about to cut them both off financially. And so it did seem like Patrick had more motive to want Dennis and Myrna dead than anybody else. A few days after the murders, Christofferson, along with an investigator from the sheriff's department, waited for Patrick inside of an interview room. Eventually, another officer led Patrick into the room, and Patrick sat down on the other side of the table. Patrick was very physically imposing. He was tall with broad shoulders, and he had short cropped hair, and he had spent some time in the Marine Corps. But once he was settled in his seat, he made it very clear that he wanted to help the investigators in any way he could. And the investigators actually couldn't help but look at each other really quickly, like they couldn't believe how soft-spoken Patrick seemed. I mean, this guy had this horrible reputation, and right now, he seemed like he was just very cooperative. But Christofferson knew looks can be deceiving, so he got right to the point, and he asked Patrick how he spent his day on Friday, May 21st, the day his in-laws were killed. And Patrick said in a very soft voice that he had spent the day just kind of hanging around the house by himself, watching TV and playing Xbox. After this, the county investigator said to Patrick, that's not exactly an airtight alibi. If he was home by himself, how could anybody corroborate that? Patrick said he understood, but he really was telling the truth. That's what he did on Friday. And then he also said he always had a great relationship with Dennis and Myrna, and he would never do anything to hurt them or to cause his wife any pain. At this point, Christofferson was nearly certain that Patrick was just lying, because basically everyone they had spoken to had said that the in-laws did not get along with Patrick. They called him the lazy bum, and they totally resented him and did not like him. So how could he possibly have a good relationship with them? And so Christofferson didn't waste any time. He leaned in and told Patrick that police had heard his relationship with the victims had been strained, to say the least, and so it seemed very likely that right now, Patrick was lying. Christofferson also pointed out Patrick's weak alibi and the fact that as a former Marine, he would know how to use a gun. Patrick didn't deny any of this and said he did own several firearms, but he said again that he really had been at home playing video games that past Friday, and he really didn't have anything to do with the murders. Christofferson told Patrick that they might have a better idea if he really was telling the truth if he allowed them to search his house. Patrick looked at both investigators, and his voice stayed calm and soft like it had the whole time, and he said yes, he would consent to a search of his home because he had nothing to hide. So not long after this interview, investigators did search Patrick and Cindy's house, and they would find multiple firearms which were confiscated. They also seized Patrick's Xbox and brought it into the crime lab for analysis. Investigators were able to see exactly when the Xbox game console was being used, and it did seem to confirm everything Patrick had said, because the Xbox had been used all day on Friday, suggesting Patrick really had been at home playing video games at the time Myrna and Dennis were murdered. And also, after closer analysis, the guns seized in Patrick and Cindy's house were not the same ones that fired the .22 caliber bullets that killed Dennis and Myrna. And so, just like Eric and Cindy, Patrick suddenly had a solid alibi. The following day, Eric walked outside of his house, he opened up his mailbox, and he found a single item inside. It was a plain white envelope with no postage on it. Eric took the envelope inside of his house, he opened it up, and he looked at the paper that was inside. And when Eric saw what was on it, his face turned pale and he started breathing heavily. His wife walked into the room and saw Eric staring at this note and clenching his jaw and shaking his head, and she asked him, "What's going on? What does the note say?" Eric walked over to his wife and just held the note out for her to read. And in strange, weirdly stilted handwriting were the words, "Fixed you." That's all it said, "Fixed you." Eric's wife immediately picked up her phone and dialed 911. A few minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the house and took this strange note into evidence. And also the deputy noticed that Eric was incredibly rattled and could barely talk. In fact, the sheriff's deputy said it seemed like Eric could actually have a heart attack. And as Eric tried to catch his breath, he would tell the deputy that he believed his parents' killer wrote this note, and somehow those two words, "fixed you," meant they were coming for him and his family next. The note forced Christofferson to view this case from a totally new angle. If somebody really did have a vendetta against the Colas, and that's why they killed Dennis and Myrna, it did seem entirely possible that they might also target the rest of the Cola family. And so that possibility obviously put way more pressure on Christofferson and his team to solve this case quickly. But the only thing that Christofferson kept coming back to that just seemed like it had to be at the heart of this case was money. Not only did Dennis and Myrna have property, investments, and huge insurance policies before they died, but also Eric had been a successful day trader and had lots of money too. So Christofferson decided he would dig deep as he could into the family's finances, hoping that might point him to a potential killer. And so back at the station, Christofferson and a forensic accountant dug through stacks of Dennis and Myrna's printed bank statements, and also they reviewed the couple's most recent online banking transactions. And as they looked at that recent online activity, something absolutely shocked them. And at first, Christofferson literally couldn't believe what he was looking at, like this had to be a mistake, because it was something so outlandish, it just shouldn't have been there. There was a transaction made on May 22nd, 2010, the day after the murders. The transaction showed a check that was cashed from Dennis's account for $50,000. Now, the name on the signature line of the check was Dennis Cola, but it was the name on the account that this check had been deposited into that really caught the investigators' attention. And suddenly the whole focus of the investigation shifted. Police immediately served a search warrant on this particular person's house, and inside they found a pair of plain white envelopes very similar to the envelope that Eric had found in his mailbox that contained the words "fixed you" on it. And when those envelopes were compared to the one that Eric had received, they contained the same manufacturing defect, proving that the envelope containing that "fixed you" note had come from this individual's house. Then a forensic document examiner looked at that $50,000 check, and he quickly determined that Dennis's signature on this check was a forgery. What's more, the forged handwriting perfectly matched the handwriting on the "fixed you" note. And so now Agent Christofferson was very confident that the person who wrote that note and then also forged the check was Dennis and Myrna's killer. Based on financial records, evidence from the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Dennis and Myrna Cola on May 21st, 2010. Around 5:30 p.m., the killer, who was inside of the Cola's house at this point, slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the home office. They watched Myrna from the hall until they were sure she was totally preoccupied with what she was doing on her computer. Then the killer slowly walked upstairs, entered one of the bedrooms, opened the closet door, and lifted the .22 caliber rifle from where it was resting on the floor. They also reached up and grabbed some ammo from the box on the shelf, then loaded the rifle and walked back downstairs. Then the killer made their way back to the home office, and they looked inside and saw Myrna was still preoccupied with the computer. And so the killer stepped forward into the room, they raised the rifle, aimed it at Myrna's head, and then pulled the trigger. A .22 caliber bullet lodged in Myrna's brain. She died instantly, slumping over her computer, with her fingers still near the last keys she had pressed. Confident that Myrna was dead, the killer crossed the room and closed the blinds. Then they walked back into the hallway, went down to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, and began to wait. About 20 minutes later, the killer heard Dennis's truck pull up outside. The killer heard the sound of the truck door opening and closing, and then the sounds of footsteps getting louder as Dennis approached the front of the house. At this point, the killer slowly got up and moved towards the back of the kitchen and put their back against the wall, sort of out of view, and continued to wait. A moment later, the killer heard Dennis's footsteps now inside of the house, his keys jangling in his hand. Then the killer saw Dennis walk into the kitchen, and immediately they raised their rifle, aimed it at Dennis's head, and fired. Dennis was dead before he even hit the ground. The killer stared at the body on the floor, and then walked back upstairs and returned the rifle to the closet, failing to notice they were not placing it in the exact spot where it had been before. After that, the killer walked to Dennis and Myrna's bedroom and opened up the dresser drawers to make it look like the home had been robbed. Then the killer opened up the drawer on the nightstand, tore out a check from Dennis's checkbook, and then wrote themselves a $50,000 check and forged Dennis's signature. The killer slipped the check into their pocket, walked back downstairs, left the house, and drove to a Shopko store to buy a hanging plant for an anniversary gift, making sure to keep the receipt to help corroborate the alibi they knew they would need. Dennis and Myrna's own son, Eric Kola, had been their killer. It would turn out Eric had only visited one Shopko store that day to buy a plant, not the two stores like he had told police. And so when detectives obtained the surveillance footage from the Shopko Eric claimed to have visited first, before going to the second one and buying the plant, well, they expected to see him browsing the garden center in this first shop, but the investigators spent hours and hours reviewing the footage from multiple cameras inside and outside the store, but there was no trace of Eric anywhere. And investigators knew that if he had not gone to that store and only went to the second one, well, he would easily have enough time to kill his parents. And so his alibi began to fall apart. And then, when investigators delved deeper into the Kola's financial records, they found that forged $50,000 check, and it was made out to Eric. And then also, when investigators began probing Eric's personal finances, they quickly discovered that Eric had been lying to them. Eric was not raking in $7,000 to $10,000 a month from day trading as he claimed. In fact, he was in serious financial trouble. His day trading had been successful in the beginning, but then the economy had tanked, and Eric's financial position plummeted, leaving him desperately broke and $150,000 in debt. But Eric continued keeping up appearances. He drove luxury cars, spoiled his kids, and retained membership at an exclusive country club. He presented himself to friends as this financial wizard, but all the while, he was actually borrowing huge sums of money from his father and then losing it on the stock market. Investigators had learned from Dennis's colleagues that Dennis was an extraordinarily generous man, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back if he thought you were in need. But Dennis's generosity had its limits. He had reached the end of his rope with his kids because he had given Eric hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he had helped pay Cindy's mortgage while her husband sat at home unemployed playing video games. And in fact, only days before the murders, Dennis had told a work colleague at the pharmacy that he was officially cutting off his children financially. Enough was enough. When police confronted Eric about the forged $50,000 check, Eric explained that his father had given him a blank check the day before he was killed, and Eric had deposited it on Saturday, having no idea his parents were dead. But police didn't believe that, because Dennis had just told his colleague that he planned to stop giving his children money. So police searched Eric's home, and they found the envelopes that matched the envelope from the Fixed You note. Eric had written that note himself and put it in his own mailbox. And so by this point, police were very sure Eric had killed his parents, and they had enough probable cause to arrest him. Police believe Eric Kola murdered his mother and father just so he could use the inheritance money to pull himself out of debt. The case against Eric was entirely circumstantial, but it was strong enough that a jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. Eric did not receive a dime of his parents' estate, but his 2 children did inherit $740,000, which they split between them. Eric continues to maintain his innocence. Late on the evening of November 15, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Lee helped his sister Elizabeth clear the dining room table in the English manor where they both worked. John was a butler at this manor, and his sister Elizabeth was a cook. And the manor itself had a name. It was called the Glen, and it was this gorgeous property right on the beach in the seaside community in England. Now, years ago, the Glen had been much more grand, and in fact, the King and Queen of England had at one point came to stay at the Glen. But recently, the Glen and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The staff was down to a skeleton crew of just John, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids, which meant virtually all the physical labor at this property fell to John to take care of. So, on this night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china in his arms to bring out to the kitchen, and as he was doing this, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also kind of helping clear the table, about an upcoming dinner party they were going to host at the Glen for some very important lawyers and politicians. But as John tried to talk to Elizabeth just wasn't really reacting. She was kind of staring off into space, and she was only carrying 1 or maybe 2 plates off the dining room table, while John is carrying like 50. And so John was becoming really annoyed with his sister. I mean, she's not really helping, and she's ignoring him. And so John was about to complain to his sister about her behavior when suddenly she turned around and she apologized to him and said, "You know what? I'm sorry I'm acting this way. I just don't feel very good, and I really think I should go lie down." Now, John was about to be really annoyed at this, but then he noticed his sister had her hands kind of reflexively over her stomach. And John knew his sister was pregnant, and so suddenly he felt like, okay, the reason she's acting this way must be because of her pregnancy. And so he did not press the issue. Now, you need to understand that Elizabeth did not tell John that she was pregnant, nor did she tell anybody else in the house, because the owners of the Glen were very traditional and very religious, and they almost certainly would not approve of Elizabeth's pregnancy because she wasn't married. At the time in England, it was not okay to have babies out of wedlock. It was viewed as like this totally taboo thing that you should never do. But despite Elizabeth's best efforts to conceal her pregnancy, John and the other 2 elderly maids very quickly realized what was going on, because every morning they would see Elizabeth vomiting because of morning sickness. And so when they approached her and said, "Hey, it looks like you're pregnant, what's going on here?" Elizabeth refused to talk about it. She did not admit to being pregnant. She just kind of said, "Leave me alone." I mean, John didn't even know who the father was. Like, Elizabeth did not want to talk to anyone about her pregnancy. But despite all that, John and the other 2 maids really wanted to support Elizabeth and help her get through this pregnancy, without being found out and potentially fired because of it. So when Elizabeth said to John that she just wanted to go lie down because she was feeling sick, he didn't press the issue, and he just told her, "You know what? I'm fine. I'll finish up. You go lay down. I hope you feel better." By 11 p.m., John was nearly done with all of his chores and he was getting ready for bed when one of the elderly maids came into the room and told John it was time for their nightly prayers. And without any hesitation, John put down the silverware that he was polishing and followed the maid into the living room where one of the owners of the Glen was waiting in her nightclothes. The owner was a 68-year-old woman named Emma Case, and at night she really liked to lead a nightly prayer with her staff. It was something she really enjoyed doing. Now, John was not a very religious person, but he really cared about Emma, and so he agreed to do these nightly prayers really just to make her happy. I mean, after all, Emma had basically saved him on multiple occasions. John had begun working for Emma 6 years earlier when he was just 14 years old. And John, he was kind of like a rough kid and a troublemaker, but Emma, she just had a soft spot for him. And at some point, when John admitted to Emma that he was really interested in traveling the world someday, Emma would help him get into the British Royal Navy. And for 2 years, John very happily served in the military and did get to see the world. But at the 2-year mark, John came down with this terrible case of pneumonia, and it forced him to leave the military early. And so when John was medically discharged, he came back home and he had no idea what he was going to do. I mean, he anticipated staying in the Navy for some time, not just 2 years. house. But luckily, Emma stepped in again, and she gave this glowing recommendation of John to one of her very wealthy friends, basically saying, hey, you should hire John. And this wealthy friend of Emma's agreed and hired John, and John was so happy, so relieved. I mean, Emma has totally picked him up again. But after getting hired, John would make a totally stupid mistake. He would steal this really expensive plate from this wealthy friend, and he would get caught. And this wealthy friend, they didn't just scold John and make him give the plate back. They got the police involved, and ultimately John would be sent to prison for 6 months for the theft. And when John got out again, he was certain nobody was going to hire him. I mean, he just went to jail for stealing. But that was when Emma, for a third time, stepped in and helped John again. Emma was a big believer in forgiving people and giving them additional chances when they screwed up. And so she said to John, you know what? I understand you made a mistake. Why don't you come back to the Glen and work for me? You can be our butler. John couldn't believe it. I mean, he knew he did not deserve this chance, especially from Emma, who's now been done wrong by him multiple times. But, he was so grateful, and he said to Emma, I'll take this, of course, and I will do anything you want, no matter what. I will do the best possible job. I'm not going to screw this up. And so far, that was exactly what John had done since coming back to the Glen. He did whatever Emma wanted, and that included nightly prayers. So on this night, after John walked into the dining room, he took a seat next to Emma at the table, and then after Elizabeth and the other 2 elderly maids took their seats at the table, they all held hands and they bowed their heads, and then Emma began to lead them in prayer. When the service was over, the 2 maids got up and headed to the kitchen to make a cup of hot cocoa for Emma. Emma typically stayed up really, really late, basically later than anybody else in the house, and she liked to drink hot cocoa and just sit by the fire and, read and write letters. It was just kind of her time to be alone and to be left alone. And so after the maids had gone, John stood up too, and he said goodnight to Emma and told her to enjoy the rest of her night, and then he made his way into the kitchen and he went into the pantry, which doubled as his bedroom. And once in the pantry, he pulled out his cot, climbed under the covers, and he fell asleep. A few hours later, at about 3:30 in the morning, John suddenly woke up in the pantry to the sound of somebody screaming outside the door. And so John, he burst out of the pantry door, and right away he's looking in the kitchen, and it's just completely covered in smoke. He can barely see, but not far from him in the kitchen was his sister and also one of the maids. And they were the ones screaming. And they were actually screaming at John to wake up and go get everybody. We need to get them out of the house and get some help. And so John, his first instinct is, okay, clearly there's a fire or something. And Emma, she's upstairs and she could be in trouble. And so John, he instinctively ran towards the stairs and began going up to the second floor to save Emma. But as he went up the stairs, the other maid was coming down the stairs looking totally frantic, and she would tell John that she was just in Emma's bedroom and she couldn't see Emma anywhere, and her bed was totally on fire. And so she didn't know if Emma was even in there, but it didn't look good. And so John, at this point, he turned and went with that maid back to the kitchen, where they linked up with John's sister and that other maid, and the 4 of them filled up buckets of water and tried to run back up the stairs to attempt to put out the fire that was in Emma's bedroom. But by the time they got back upstairs, the fire up there had really spread, and there was like a wall of fire right in front of Emma's bedroom. So there was no way to really get through it, and their little buckets of water did nothing. And so even though they hated the idea of leaving Emma potentially behind, the 4 of them knew they couldn't do anything more. And so finally, the 4 of them turned and began running downstairs to evacuate. And as they ran through the dining room on the first floor, they would find Emma. She was laying on the ground, sprawled out, and it was obvious to all 4 of them that she was clearly dead. However, it was also obvious that the fire had not killed her. She had clearly been hacked to death. She had all these horrible wounds on her head that looked like somebody had taken an axe basically to her head, and her neck was so deeply cut, it was almost like someone tried to remove her head. John and Elizabeth and the 2 maids just stood there staring in shock at Emma, not even sure what to do. And then one of the maids just started screaming, and then all 4 of them just turned and ran out of the house. Eventually, some neighbors, some local fishermen, and members of the Coast Guard were able to put out the fire at the Glen. But this was not just a fire, this was a murder. And so when police came to investigate, suspicion immediately fell on John. This was back in the day, well before forensic science was used in investigations. And so at the time, the way police kind of figured out who done it is by intuition and gut feeling and assumptions. I mean, it was basically like pseudoscience. But at the time, that's how it was. And quickly, the police determined that whoever had killed Emma and inflicted these horrible injuries on her, they had to be really strong. And so the assumption was, John is the only man in the house, and so very likely the strongest person in the house, and so he must have been the one to do this, because it didn't look like anybody else had the strength to do this. Also, the investigators found these blood trails underneath the rubble from the fire that showed Emma had not actually been murdered where she was found on the ground in the dining room. Instead, she had actually been killed in the hallway near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And basically right outside of John's pantry door was a bloody hatchet and a bloody knife. And on top of all of that, investigators also determined that the fire had been set intentionally, and the person who set it had used this particular type of oil that was very flammable, and they had doused it all over the house and ignited it. And it turned out the only place where this oil was located inside of the Glen was inside of the pantry where John slept. So on the same day this whole fire breaks out and they find Emma dead, John was arrested for Emma's murder. The next day, John was in his jail cell, and a guard came down the hall and rapped on the bars and told John he had a visitor. His lawyer was here to talk to him. But John was confused because he didn't have a lawyer, so he had no idea who this was. But regardless, the guard opened up the cell and he led John down the hallway to this room, and when John walked in, he saw there was this man who was very well dressed and very handsome. He was sitting at this table, and clearly he was waiting for John. And John, at first he didn't really know who this guy was, but then it dawned on him that he knows who this guy is, and it made no sense that he was here to defend John. The man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer, highly respected in the area, and he also happened to be one of Emma's absolute closest friends. So Reginald Templar, Emma's close friend, the woman who's been murdered, is here to defend the person who's accused of killing Emma? It just didn't make any sense. But eventually, Reginald gestured for John to come in the room and sit down. And so John just kind of made his way in and he sat down, and Reginald immediately said, "John, I know you did not kill Emma. That's why I'm here." John was so relieved, and before long, he was pouring out all the information he could about everything he could recall about the night of the fire and the murder. And as he did, Reginald took all these notes, and he began creating a framework for John's defense. And so by the time John was back in his jail cell, he couldn't help but feel kind of optimistic that maybe with Reginald's help, he could actually beat this thing and prove he didn't do this. But John's relief would be short-lived. His first court appearance went extremely well. Reginald showed up in a fancy suit, and he was just completely on his game and just ripped the prosecution apart and basically said their entire case was just circumstantial, and he rattled off all these legal precedents, which John didn't really understand, but he looked up and saw the judge definitely knew these precedents and was impressed with what Reginald was doing. And then also Reginald would say that the police did a terrible job investigating. They basically didn't investigate and just jumped to conclusions that it was John. And so as Reginald is basically destroying the prosecution, Reginald looked over at the prosecutor, and he could tell the prosecutor looked really nervous. And so John was really starting to feel confident that Reginald was exactly what he needed. But on the day of the second court appearance, Reginald just didn't show up. With no explanation, he didn't contact anybody, and so John just sat there waiting to see what was going to happen. The judge delayed for as long as he could, but eventually when, Reginald still didn't show up, the judge looked to John and said, "I'm sorry, but you're going to have to defend yourself." Which, of course, John did not know how to do. I mean, he barely had even gone to school, let alone studied law. And from there, things only got worse for John. Reginald continued to miss court dates with no explanation, and then on other times he would show up to court, but instead of being this fantastic, very sharp lawyer, he kind of acted like a maniac. He would start all these unnecessary fights with the judge over totally irrelevant matters, like how to pronounce a particular word, and then when he had witnesses on the stand, his line of questioning didn't make any sense. He would ask things like, "Well, what did you have for breakfast today?" and "What's your favorite color?" And then finally, Reginald just withdrew altogether from the case, leaving John with no lawyer at all, which admittedly might have actually been an improvement for John. After Reginald withdrew, another lawyer found out about it and took pity on John and volunteered to take on the case. But it was on very short notice, and this other lawyer had good intentions, but was not nearly as skilled as Reginald was when he was kind of on his game on that first day. And so really quickly, this lawyer kind of fumbled the case, and then when it went to the jury to decide whether or not John was guilty, it took them less than an hour to come back and say, oh yeah, he's guilty, he killed Emma. And so John was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, John sat in his jail cell waiting for his execution. And as he waited, he continually insisted that he really was innocent and that ultimately God would protect him. Finally, February 23rd, 1885 rolled around. This was the day of John's execution, except something very weird happened on this day. When John was led from the jail to the gallows where he was going to be executed, the hangman could not get the gallows to work. The trap door in the gallows where the condemned stands, where it's supposed to open up and they fall down and the noose breaks their neck, yeah, that trap door, it would not function whenever John was standing on it. Now, when John was moved off the trap door, it functioned perfectly fine. It was only when he was on that trap door that it would not work. And so think about this. Pretend you're John. 3 different times, the hangman led him onto that trapdoor. They put the noose around his neck, put a bag over his head, asked him for his last words, and they threw that lever, and each time John is expecting to die, and it's not working. Finally, after the 3rd failure, the hangman just called off the execution, and then actually a judge would weigh in and say, you know what? We cannot possibly attempt for a 4th time to execute John. This constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, and so they swapped his sentence from a death sentence to 22 years in prison. And none of this would make any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma's murder, when John, by this point, was just sitting in a jail cell and everybody had forgotten about him. On that day in 1890, a group of very high society type people, politicians and lawyers and rich people, they all gathered in this misty cemetery not far from the Glen. The group was in the cemetery for the burial of a very important and well-respected man who had died after slowly going insane. And as the priest finished his final blessing, the mourners began chucking handfuls of dirt into the grave, and as they did, one of them said quietly but out loud, "Today, we have buried a murderer." Here's what many people believe really happened on the night of November 15th, 1884, when Emma was killed. At the time of Emma's murder, Elizabeth's pregnancy was very scandalous, but not just for Elizabeth. It was also scandalous for the father of the baby, the father who nobody knew except for Elizabeth. And it was scandalous for this father because, like Elizabeth, he was worried what society would think if they found out he was having a baby out of wedlock, especially with Elizabeth, who basically from a societal standpoint was kind of below his station. But despite all that, the father of the baby did not attempt to distance himself from Elizabeth. Instead, on the night of the murder, the father of the baby actually decided to sneak into the Glen to see Elizabeth. But Emma was still awake. She was up late, drinking her hot cocoa, writing and reading, and she heard the sound of the father coming into her home. And so she got up to go investigate, and she would eventually find the father up in the hallway right outside of Elizabeth's bedroom. And remember, Emma is very traditional, she's very conservative and religious, and she's seeing this strange man in her house clearly going into or coming out of Elizabeth's room, and she was so offended and angry, and so Emma just began screaming at this guy to get out of her house, and if he didn't, she was going to tell the whole world about this illicit relationship. And then Emma walked up and hit this guy right in the face, and at this point, the father just snapped, and he flew into this rage, and he began screaming back at Emma, and then he grabbed a hatchet that was on the wall right near the pantry, he pulled it off, and he brought it down right on top of Emma's head, and Emma crumpled to the ground. And the man, he's looking down at Emma, and he's realizing he's inflicted this horrific injury on Emma, and if she doesn't die, she's gonna tell someone, and then this father is gonna go to jail, if not worse. So, in a moment of panic, this father runs into the kitchen, gets a kitchen knife, comes back, and he finished Emma off. Once she was deceased, he dragged her back to the dining room where she normally did her reading and writing, and then he doused her and the whole house in that weird oil that he found in the pantry where John was sleeping, and after getting the whole house covered in it, he ignited it, and then he ran out of the house. But over the next 6 years, Emma's killer felt so bad about what he had done, both to Emma and then nearly killing Elizabeth and his unborn child, that he went completely insane, and this caused his physical health to totally fail, and he died. But right before he died, as he's laying in his deathbed, he began ranting and raving about all the things he regretted in his life, including murdering a woman at a big, beautiful seaside estate. Basically, he was admitting to killing Emma, and he did it in the company of all the people who would then be at his burial. And so that's why, as they're throwing the dirt onto his casket, they're saying, "Today we buried a murderer." The killer's identity was none other than Reginald Templar, John's lawyer. Now, nobody knows if Reginald took John's case because he felt guilty and wanted to prevent an innocent man from going to jail, or if he just wanted to sabotage John's case to ensure he did go to jail to protect himself. Like, we don't know. Either way, though, it was during the course of this trial that Reginald began his descent into madness, which would ultimately lead to his death. Some people believe the reason the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on that trap door and it wouldn't open was because of divine intervention. That God or a god or some deity came to earth and literally interfered with the execution to spare John's life. And the reason people think that is because, John really was an innocent man and he did not deserve to die. John would serve all 22 years of his sentence, and then when he got out, he became famous for being the man who could not be hanged. John would eventually get married, and he would move to America, where he would live a very happy and quiet life until he died at the age of 81. Hey everybody, as mentioned earlier, right now you can listen to over 100 new stories on the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. It's available on all of them. And so right now, I'm going to play you a clip from an episode of the MrBallen podcast. It's called Rendezvous in Capistrano. Enjoy. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. If you like that trailer and you want to hear the whole story, just go ahead and look up the MrBallen podcast on any podcast platform. It's free. And then once you find it on Apple, Spotify, wherever, just give the show a follow and then start your binge. Or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the MrBallen podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Go follow, go listen. So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, then you need to check out all the Ballen Studios podcasts. You can find all of those podcasts simply by searching for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform. Okay, that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here.
City lights are fading, lost in this decay. Echoes in the...
On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed and she was pretty upset by this. But at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue. But as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room, and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed, and he took her hand, and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her, and she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that. I'm fine. She could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door, the door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. And just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that Head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane, and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look. And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute, this person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen, and he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath, and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, I'm sorry. He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag, he unzips it, and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court and he would be sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Snowball Effect. On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well-educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over. And then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened. And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home. And then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what? I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff. It's fine. I totally forgive you. Everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates. And so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now. And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door. But before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off. And the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at, but Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't. And so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. She was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this 3rd woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her. And so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him. And the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive. He looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders.
Dark skies have passed us by, no more tears to cry. We stand up, arms wide, ready for a brighter side. Wounds heal, time flows in the light. Life grows, scars now fade. They show strength in every blow. We rise, we shine from the storm. We find a brighter day, a brighter way. Our hearts aligned. Goes were rough, we know, but now we let it go. In the sun's warm glow, we find our seeds to sow. All the pain behind, new paths to find. We leave it all, climb past the wall. We rise, we shine from the storm. We find a brighter day, a brighter way. Our hearts aligned.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next